If there is one player in NBA history who seemed completely immune to the rules of normal life, it was Dennis Rodman, a man who won 5 NBA championships, a man who captured 7 consecutive rebounding titles, a man who became one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet without ever being known for scoring points, and a man who earned tens of millions of dollars while living a life so wild that even Michael Jordan once admitted people were literally betting on whether Dennis would survive long enough to reach middle age. For years, Rodman seemed untouchable. The colorful hair, the outrageous outfits, the endless parties, the celebrity relationships, the championships, the fame, the money. It felt like the ride would never end. But fast forward to today, and the picture looks very different. Approaching his 65th birthday, Dennis Rodman is no longer the larger-than-life superstar dominating headlines every week. The man who once traveled the world like a rock star now lives a much quieter existence. His fortune has largely disappeared. His personal life has been filled with legal battles, addiction struggles, and painful betrayals. And despite earning millions during his playing career, estimates suggest his net worth today sits at only a fraction of what many fans would expect. So what exactly happened? How did one of basketball's most unforgettable icons go from NBA royalty to fighting financial and personal battles behind the scenes? And here's what almost nobody talks about. The biggest threat to Dennis Rodman's life wasn't the spending. It wasn't the gambling. It wasn't even the addictions. It was someone he completely trusted, someone he called family. But we'll get to that. First, to understand how everything collapsed, you have to understand where it all began. Because the story starts somewhere most people have no idea about. Dennis Keith Rodman entered the world on May 13, 1961, in Trenton, New Jersey. From the start, stability was something he rarely experienced. His father left the family when Dennis was only 3 years old, creating a wound that would follow him throughout much of his life. The abandonment wasn't temporary, it was permanent. Over the years, Rodman's father reportedly had dozens of children with different women and eventually settled in the Philippines. Dennis grew up virtually without a relationship with him. Imagine trying to understand your place in the world while knowing your father was out there somewhere, raising other children, building other families, and had simply chosen not to come back for you. For Dennis, that silence became his normal. His mother, Shirley, was left to carry the burden alone. She worked multiple jobs simply to keep the family afloat. Money was always tight. Opportunities were limited. And while his sisters excelled athletically, Dennis struggled to find where he fit in. In fact, what he looked like as a teenager would shock almost every fan who knows him today. The future Hall of Famer wasn't a basketball prodigy. He wasn't a highly recruited superstar. He wasn't even considered a serious player. When he graduated from South Oak Cliff High School in Dallas, he stood only around 5'6" and couldn't even make the school basketball team. Think about that for a moment. One of the greatest rebounders in NBA history couldn't make his high school team. His sisters were local basketball stars. Dennis was the forgotten one. Quiet, shy, awkward, invisible, and things were about to get even harder. After graduation, his mother reportedly kicked him out of the house. Suddenly, the young man who already felt unwanted by his father was now being pushed out into the world with nowhere to go. To survive, Rodman took a job working as a janitor at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Night after night, he cleaned floors, a teenager mopping hallways while the world moved around him, completely unaware that his name would one day be carved into basketball history. Nothing about his situation suggested future stardom. Nothing suggested championships. Nothing suggested millions of dollars. And yet, something was quietly about to change everything. Because during this difficult period, something happened that defied all logic. Dennis Rodman started growing, and he didn't just grow a little. He exploded upward, nearly a foot in height almost overnight. The teenager who had once been considered too small for competitive basketball was suddenly a legitimate prospect. For the first time in his life, doors started opening. A family friend connected him with a junior college basketball program in Texas. He seized the opportunity. Then he transferred to Southeastern Oklahoma State University, where his game truly began to flourish. The overlooked janitor was suddenly dominating opponents, rebounding everything, playing with a relentless intensity that coaches couldn't ignore. A few years earlier, he was mopping airport floors and wondering where he would sleep. Now NBA scouts were watching him, and in 1986, the Detroit Pistons selected Dennis Rodman in the second round of the NBA draft. The homeless kid, the rejected teenager, the airport janitor, was officially headed to the NBA. But here's the thing, reaching the league was only the beginning of the story. Because what Dennis Rodman was about to become in Detroit wasn't just a basketball player, it was something the sport had never quite seen before. When he arrived in Detroit in 1986, the Pistons were building something unique. This wasn't a team built on flashy highlights or superstar glamour. It was a team built on toughness, intimidation, and a willingness to outwork everyone in front of them. The culture fit Rodman perfectly. He wasn't the most skilled player on the roster. He wasn't the most famous. He wasn't the leading scorer. But what he lacked in offensive talent, he made up for with relentless effort. Dennis chased every loose ball as if his career depended on it. He fought for every rebound. He defended every possession with a level of intensity that quickly separated him from everyone else. Veterans on the team immediately noticed something different about him. While other players cared about points, Dennis cared about stopping the other guy from scoring. While others wanted recognition, Rodman was willing to do the dirty work nobody else wanted. And that mindset transformed him into one of the most valuable players in basketball. Before long, he became a crucial member of Detroit's legendary Bad Boys teams. The nickname wasn't an exaggeration. The Pistons were feared throughout the league. Physical, aggressive, unapologetic. They turned basketball games into wars. And Dennis Rodman was one of their most dangerous weapons. The results spoke for themselves. Detroit captured back-to-back NBA championships in 1989 and 1990. Rodman wasn't simply along for the ride. He was becoming one of the league's premier defenders, winning consecutive Defensive Player of the Year awards. But while his basketball career was reaching new heights, something else was beginning to change. The quiet, reserved young man from Dallas was slowly disappearing. In his place emerged a completely different Dennis Rodman. A louder Dennis. A stranger Dennis. A version of himself the sports world had never seen before. The hairstyles became more outrageous. The clothing became more unconventional. The public appearances became increasingly unpredictable. Eventually, Dennis Rodman stopped trying to fit into society's expectations and created his own rules, his own image, his own identity. And whether people loved him or hated him, they couldn't stop watching, which made what came next feel almost inevitable. Because there was only one destination for a personality like Dennis Rodman. One city, one team, one dynasty. When the Chicago Bulls acquired Dennis Rodman in 1995, many people believed the move would either be brilliant or disastrous. There would be no middle ground. The Bulls already had Michael Jordan. They already had Scottie Pippen. They already had championship aspirations. What they needed was rebounding, defense, energy, someone willing to do everything the superstars didn't want to do. Rodman checked every box. But behind the scenes, something alarming was already happening. Something the championship celebrations would temporarily hide. Despite earning millions, reports indicated Rodman had already accumulated substantial debt. Money seemed to disappear as quickly as it arrived. Luxury purchases, expensive vacations, impulsive spending. At one point, Rodman was reportedly more than $1 million in debt, despite earning a professional athlete's salary. For most people, that would have been a devastating wake-up call. For Dennis Rodman, it barely registered. Fortunately, an agent named Dwight Manley stepped in and immediately realized how serious the situation had become. Missed payments, growing debt, financial obligations piling up from every direction. Manley attempted to impose structure, budgets, spending limits, financial oversight. For perhaps the first time in his life, someone was genuinely trying to protect Dennis from himself. And while those financial problems continued to quietly grow behind the scenes, something extraordinary was happening on the court. The Bulls were becoming unstoppable. If the Detroit years made Dennis Rodman famous, the Chicago years made him immortal. The Bulls exploded into one of the greatest dynasties sports had ever seen. Michael Jordan was the superstar. Scottie Pippen was the versatile sidekick. Dennis Rodman was the chaos factor that completed the equation. Every championship team needs someone willing to sacrifice personal glory. That was Dennis. Night after night, he dominated the glass against players who were bigger, stronger, and often more talented offensively. Yet somehow the ball always seemed to find him. Again, and again, and again. The Bulls won 3 consecutive championships with Rodman on the roster. The famous 72-win season, historic playoff runs, iconic moments. Dennis Rodman stood right in the middle of it all. But while championships were piling up, another battle was quietly taking place. Because the more successful Dennis became, the more dangerous his lifestyle was becoming. And the money flowing into his bank account, instead of creating security, was creating a monster. Soon, millions of dollars would begin disappearing almost as quickly as he earned them. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about Dennis Rodman's financial collapse. The parties weren't the real problem. The cars weren't the real problem. Even the gambling wasn't the real problem. The real problem was something far more devastating, and it was waiting just around the corner. By the late 1990s, Dennis Rodman was living the kind of life most people only imagine. He was an NBA superstar, a 5-time champion, one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. Money was pouring in from every direction. The problem was that it flowed right back out, and then some. For Dennis, spending wasn't something he carefully planned. It was instinct. If he wanted something, he bought it. If he liked a place, he stayed. If he felt like celebrating, he celebrated without limits. And nowhere represented that lifestyle better than Las Vegas. For Rodman, Las Vegas wasn't a vacation destination, it was almost a second home. One famous trip was supposed to last only a few days. Instead, it stretched into more than a month. The parties never stopped. The gambling never stopped. The spending never stopped. Friends close to Rodman later recalled how effortlessly he could burn through tens of thousands of dollars during a single trip. A normal weekend for most people could become a $30,000 adventure for Dennis Rodman, sometimes even more. What's remarkable isn't that he spent enormous amounts. It's that he seemed completely unconcerned about where the money was going. Saving wasn't exciting, budgeting wasn't exciting, thinking about the future wasn't exciting, living in the moment was. And Dennis Rodman lived in the moment better than almost anyone. Then there were the cars, the properties, the private parties. At one point, he reportedly transformed part of his own property into a private nightclub. Think about that. Most people go to clubs. Dennis Rodman built one. The lifestyle looked glamorous from the outside, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming, and they were spreading faster than anyone realized, because the spending was expensive. But it wasn't the most costly part of Dennis Rodman's life, not even close. That distinction belonged to something else entirely, his behavior. Throughout his NBA career, Rodman developed a reputation for pushing boundaries, and sometimes crossing them completely. Referees, opposing players, even teammates. The incidents started adding up: fines, suspensions, lost salaries, missed opportunities. One of the most infamous moments came during the 1997 season, when Rodman lashed out during a game and kicked a referee. The punishment was severe: massive fines, game suspensions, lost income. By the time everything was calculated, that single moment reportedly cost him around $1 million. One decision, 1 second of losing control, $1 million gone. Most people would never recover psychologically from that. Most people would change. Dennis Rodman wasn't most people. Perhaps the most famous example of his unpredictability came during the Bulls' championship run, when Rodman disappeared to Las Vegas in the middle of the season. Phil Jackson had given him a short break. Dennis turned it into an adventure. Eventually, Michael Jordan himself reportedly had to help track him down. For many organizations, that would have ended careers. But Dennis wasn't replaceable. Still, every incident had consequences. The fines kept coming. The legal disputes started multiplying. The tax problems arrived. Then the child support battles. The bills were no longer arriving one at a time. They were arriving all at once. And Dennis Rodman's financial foundation, already shaky from years of reckless spending, was beginning to crack under the weight. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Because while all of this was happening, someone he completely trusted was making it all so much worse. As the years passed and his playing career faded, the financial pressures became even more intense. The NBA paychecks stopped, the endorsements slowed, but the obligations remained. Court records revealed years of disputes involving child support payments that had grown into staggering figures, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then even more. Eventually, Headlines began describing a reality that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. A man who had earned tens of millions during his career was now claiming serious financial hardship. People couldn't believe it. How does someone earn that much money and end up here? The answer was a combination of spending, poor financial decisions, legal troubles, tax issues, and something else. Something that would turn out to be the darkest chapter of Dennis Rodman's financial life. Because just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, someone he trusted completely was allegedly stealing everything that was left. For years, Dennis Rodman believed he had finally found someone looking out for his best interests. Someone he considered family. Someone he publicly thanked. That person was Peggy Ann Fulford. At first, everything appeared normal. She presented herself as a sophisticated financial expert, successful, connected, educated, the type of person capable of helping wealthy athletes manage complicated finances. Rodman believed her completely. She spoke confidently. She carried herself like a professional. And over time, she gained access to something more valuable than any bank account: his trust. But here's what investigators would eventually uncover. The impressive credentials weren't real. The success stories weren't what they appeared. And by the time the truth emerged, enormous amounts of money had already disappeared. For Dennis Rodman, the revelation wasn't just financially devastating. It was a betrayal at the deepest possible level. He had trusted her completely. He had publicly thanked her. He had considered her family. Now he was discovering that millions of dollars had allegedly been moved, transferred, and spent without his knowledge. The abandoned child who had spent his entire life searching for people he could trust had been betrayed. Again. And unfortunately, Dennis Rodman still wasn't finished paying the price. Because while financial problems were destroying one part of his life, a different battle was quietly consuming another. A battle involving alcohol. One that would follow him for years, and push him to the very edge. By the time Dennis Rodman's NBA career officially came to an end, the championships were over, the sold-out arenas were gone, the daily structure that basketball had provided simply disappeared. And for a man who had spent years living at maximum speed, the silence proved incredibly difficult to survive. Many athletes struggle after retirement. Few struggle as publicly as Dennis Rodman did. Former teammate John Sally once pointed out an interesting fact. Dennis wasn't always a heavy drinker. In fact, he reportedly didn't even start drinking until relatively late in life. But once alcohol entered the picture, it became increasingly difficult to control. The parties, the nightlife, the constant attention, the pressure of a fading fame. Everything in Dennis Rodman's world seemed connected to drinking. And what made the situation particularly dangerous was that his entire public image had been built around unpredictability. When he acted wildly, people laughed. When he made headlines, people expected it. When he disappeared for days, it almost seemed normal. Nobody could tell where the performance ended and the crisis began. As the years passed, the warning signs became harder to ignore. Public outbursts, erratic interviews, strained relationships, increasing legal trouble. By 2014, concerns had reached a breaking point. After one of his highly publicized trips to North Korea, Rodman entered a rehabilitation facility seeking help for alcohol-related issues. Those close to him admitted the situation had become serious. Very serious. For perhaps the first time in years, Dennis was being forced to confront something he could no longer simply laugh away. But recovery is rarely a straight line. In 2018, Rodman was arrested for driving under the influence. His blood alcohol level was far above the legal limit. Many fans wondered whether they were watching a slow-motion tragedy unfold. After everything he had already survived, people feared the worst. After all, this was a man who had spent decades pushing every limit imaginable. Physically, emotionally, mentally, financially. There comes a point when even the strongest people begin paying the price. And yet somehow, impossibly, stubbornly, defiantly, Dennis Rodman kept surviving. One of the strangest things about Dennis Rodman's life is that people have been predicting his downfall for decades. Even during his playing days, there were whispers that his lifestyle would eventually catch up with him. Some believed he wouldn't make it past middle age. Others believed his addictions would destroy him. But Dennis kept proving people wrong. Not because he was perfect, far from it. He made mistakes. Costly ones, painful ones, some that cost him millions. some that cost him relationships he could never fully repair. But through all the chaos, Dennis Rodman displayed something remarkable, an almost supernatural ability to survive. He survived poverty. He survived abandonment. He survived financial collapse. He survived addiction. He survived public humiliation. And somehow, despite everything, he remained standing. That resilience would become even more remarkable as Dennis entered what may be the strangest chapter of his entire life, a chapter so bizarre that if it appeared in a movie script, most audiences would demand it be rewritten. Because somehow, against all rational explanation, Dennis Rodman became friends with one of the most powerful and controversial leaders on the planet. If someone had predicted in the 1990s that Dennis Rodman would one day become one of the most recognizable Americans in North Korea, nobody would have believed it, and yet that's exactly what happened. In 2013, Rodman traveled to North Korea as part of a basketball-related event. At first, it seemed like another unusual celebrity appearance, something that would generate headlines for a few days before fading away. Instead, it became an international story that nobody saw coming. Upon arriving, Rodman found himself in front of massive crowds and government officials. Then came the moment that changed everything. He met Kim Jong-un. The images that followed were surreal. Dennis Rodman sitting courtside with one of the world's most powerful and controversial leaders, laughing, talking basketball, sharing public appearances as if they were old friends. Critics were stunned. Supporters were confused. The media couldn't stop covering it. Some accused Rodman of legitimizing a controversial regime. Others argued he was attempting something closer to unofficial diplomacy. Dennis himself insisted that basketball had opened a door, that he was building bridges between people. Whether you agreed with him or not, one thing was undeniable. Nobody else could have found themselves in that position. Only Dennis Rodman. Only the man who had spent his entire life doing the unexpected. But while the world debated his friendship with Kim Jong-un, another reality was quietly taking shape back home. The money that had once seemed endless was nearly gone, and the number that would soon emerge, the number representing everything left of his NBA fortune, was about to shock everyone. For years, Dennis Rodman lived like money would never stop coming, and during the height of his career, it probably felt exactly that way. The endorsements, the appearance fees, the sponsorships, the NBA contracts, the championship bonuses, everything pointed toward a future of financial security. Yet today, the numbers tell a very different story. As Dennis Rodman approaches his 65th birthday, various estimates place his net worth at roughly $500,000. Let that sink in for a moment. $500,000. For most people, that's still significant, but for a man who earned approximately $27 million during his NBA career alone, and considerably more through endorsements and appearances, it represents only a sliver of what once passed through his hands. When adjusted for inflation, his career earnings would be worth substantially more in today's dollars. Yet most of it is gone. The spending, the legal battles, the taxes, the child support disputes, the fines, the failed financial decisions, the betrayal by someone he trusted completely. Together, they created the perfect storm, one that gradually eroded a fortune many athletes would have protected for generations. And yet, despite everything, the Dennis Rodman brand still carries real value. His image remains instantly recognizable around the world. Fans still pay to meet him. Collectors still want his autograph. Event organizers still call. Fashion brands still recognize his cultural weight. The world may have moved on from the 1990s, but it hasn't forgotten Dennis Rodman. And while Dennis was spending decades building one of the most chaotic legacies in sports history, someone else in his family was quietly building something completely different. Something that would give the Rodman name an entirely new meaning. If Dennis Rodman's story often feels like a cautionary tale, his daughter Trinity Rodman's story feels like a fresh beginning. Born into a famous name with a complicated reputation, Trinity could have spent her life living in the shadow of her father's legacy, both the glory and the chaos. Instead, she created her own, through talent, through discipline, through hard work. While Dennis became famous for rebounding basketballs, Trinity became one of the biggest stars in women's soccer. And unlike her father's journey, hers has been marked by stability, professionalism, and remarkable success at a young age. A record-setting contract eventually established her among the highest-paid players in women's soccer, at an age when many athletes are still finding their footing. One generation losing millions, the next generation building something entirely new. For Dennis, watching his daughter succeed appears to have become one of the most important motivations in his life. He has spoken openly about wanting to be healthier, wanting to be present, wanting to be around for his children. After decades of living only for the moment, those words represent something significant. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, Dennis Rodman isn't focused solely on Dennis Rodman. He's focused on what comes after him, and that may be one of the most meaningful victories of his entire life. For all the mistakes, for all the controversies, for all the chaos, one fact remains impossible to deny. Dennis Rodman was one of the greatest defensive players basketball has ever seen. Time hasn't changed that. If anything, it has only deepened the appreciation. Five NBA championships, 7 consecutive rebounding titles, 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, an NBA Hall of Fame career, a player who completely redefined what impact could look like on a basketball court without ever leading a team in scoring. And in 2026, that legacy received formal recognition that many felt was long overdue. The Chicago Bulls announced plans to retire Rodman's iconic number 91 jersey. This was the player who helped anchor one of the greatest dynasties in sports history. The player whose energy and rebounding often changed the course of games that looked out of reach. Now his number would take its place among the legends hanging above the United Center. A permanent reminder. The same year, Rodman was inducted into the celebrity wing of the WWE Hall of Fame, recognition of something many people forget. Dennis Rodman wasn't just an NBA player. He was a cultural phenomenon. He crossed into wrestling, television, fashion, entertainment, and everywhere he went, he remained impossible to ignore. Even his Hall of Fame speech generated headlines. Because of course it did. This is Dennis Rodman we're talking about. No matter how much time passes, he still finds a way to surprise people. So how does Dennis Rodman actually live today? The answer is probably less dramatic than most people expect. The parties aren't making headlines every week anymore. The wild Vegas adventures are largely in the past. The daily chaos that once defined his life has slowed considerably. These days, Dennis appears to spend much of his time making appearances, connecting with fans, and focusing on his health. Reports suggest he has reduced his alcohol consumption. He's worked on improving his physical condition. He's spoken about wanting a healthier future. For someone who spent decades living on the edge, even small improvements are significant. And perhaps the most remarkable part of all? He's still here, because there was a time when many people genuinely doubted he would be. Even Michael Jordan once recalled hearing stories about people placing bets on how long Dennis Rodman would live. It sounds unbelievable, but that's how extreme his lifestyle appeared to the outside world. Yet somehow, against all odds, he kept going. The abandoned child kept going. The airport janitor kept going. The rebounding champion kept going. The addict kept going. The bankrupt superstar kept going. The man who made a career out of defying expectations is still defying them. And maybe that's the real lesson of Dennis Rodman's story. Not the money, not the championships, not the controversies, not even the fame. The lesson is survival. Is it sad that a man who earned millions has only a fraction of that wealth remaining today? Absolutely. There is no way around that reality. The financial losses are real. The mistakes are real. The regrets are real. But reducing Dennis Rodman's life to a dollar figure misses something important. Because Dennis Rodman never lived an ordinary life. He never wanted to. He didn't play basketball the way everyone else did. He didn't dress the way everyone else did. He didn't think the way everyone else did. And he certainly didn't live the way everyone else did. For better or worse, Dennis Rodman spent his life entirely on his own terms. Sometimes those choices brought incredible success. Sometimes they brought painful consequences. Sometimes they brought both at the same time. But every chapter was undeniably his. And perhaps that's exactly why people remain fascinated by him decades later. Because long after the championships ended, and long after the headlines faded, Dennis Rodman remains exactly what he has always been. A one of one, a survivor, a mystery, and one of the most unforgettable figures the world of sports has ever produced. What part of Dennis Rodman's story surprised you the most? Was it the financial downfall, the betrayal, the battle with alcohol, or the fact that after everything he's been through, he's still here telling the story? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the lives of sports legends.